the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning off his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His days are marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel written burnished rows of steel. As ye deal with my condemner, so with you my grace shall deal. Let a hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my fit. Our God, he is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea. With the glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. His truth is marching
All right, all right, all right. How are we all tonight? Can you all hear me? My microphone's apparently working properly today. That's good to hear. The OBS keeps resetting my audio to things. I think it's a Windows 11 problem. Windows 11 is horrible. Anyway, how have we all been? I know you're getting 2 streams in very short order from me. However, this has been a truly incredible time to be an observer of human history. Uh, I don't think I've seen anything go so poorly, so quickly in a very, very long time. I had a conversation with Hetman last night. He thought he might join us, but I kind of doubted that about all this. And the situation in Iran, I think, has become emblematic of the problem with modern discourse. we have a lot of people who are talking very much about these things, and they don't really understand them. And so they're celebrating these bombings and these strikes and all that, and they're like, well, this is clearly we're winning, and they don't know how to put these things together in a really coherent manner, and how to understand that just because you have done a thing doesn't mean you should have done the thing. It's that Malcolm speech from Jurassic Park. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit tonight. And then we're going to talk about a video President Sunday put out a few days ago that I watched and I have comments on. But first, I think we should talk about an update of what's happening in Iran. Yesterday, news went out that a Marine Expeditionary Unit consisting of about 5,000 American servicemen overall and 2,500 Marines has been dispatched to the Middle East. It will arrive in approximately 2 weeks. The objective of this Marine Expeditionary Unit is at this time unclear. However, MEUs are the frontline invasion forces of the United States of America. They are sent in prior to they're considered the firefighters or the 911 of the United States military. For example, in Afghanistan in 2001, the Marine Expeditionary Force was the first force to respond and take the fight to the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. This is a sizable force, and the thought is that they are going to go to a place near Iran called Karg Island. And what Karg Island is the principal oil terminal from which Iran ships out its crude oil shipments from tankers. Approximately 90% of all crude oil that Iran exports leaves through Karg Island. And last night, Donald Trump bombed Karg Island in some capacity. He claims that only military facilities were hit. However, more than one person has noted that there are not that many military facilities on the island to begin with, and most of it is a civilian location for the export of oil, which is not strategically unsound. However, it is naturally questionable. The destruction of Karg Island's facilities would be devastating to Iran's economy. The capture of these facilities is thought to be devastating to Iran's economy too. And the thought is that this Marine Expeditionary Unit will be heading to Karg Island to capture it. This is a bad idea on a lot of levels. What these groups are consisting of is there are a number of warships and centered around an amphibious assault ship. And what an amphibious assault ship is basically a small carrier. And it carries a aircraft designed specifically to support the Marine Expeditionary Units in the group. Harriers, Super Cobras, transport helicopters, etc. Eventually, they're going to be switching out these Harriers for the much more capable F-35C. But this is the center of the group, and so in order to get to Karg Island, you have to move into close to Iran, which leaves you the ships vulnerable to attack. And once you are on Karg Island, the Marines themselves become very vulnerable to attack. Because what we have seen is that there has been a appreciable loss of fire coming out of Iran in terms of drones and long-range missiles. However, Karg Island is not long range. It's very, very close. It is very close to Iran, which means they can bring much more weapons to bear against those Marines. And the only air defense that those Marines would have at that point are the embarked aircraft on the LPH and the warships' missile batteries. Because unless they set up their own Patriot battery, which again will take time. So there is a very good chance that if Marines land on this island, two things will happen. The first is that Iran will probably destroy it. And this will be devastating to Iran in the very short term. But they do have a number of other oil terminals throughout the region that they can either use at a much lower capacity or bring up to a higher capacity if they want. The second is that you will have 2,500 U.S. Marines sitting in a location where they are very, very vulnerable to attack from short-range Iranian munitions. This is the land invasion that everyone thought was a horrible idea. Now, I want to stress at this time, it's unclear what the intention of the deployment of the MEU is at this time. So they might not be doing that. This might just be shuffling Marines around to intimidate Iran. this is unlikely to be successful as well. Fundamentally, most observers, being not really military analysts or historians or, smart, don't understand how Iran's army works and how their military works. They never intended to be able to take the United States in a stand-up fight, and they knew that. The idea is to survive, to keep punching out, striking out randomly, creating so much chaos and confusion that the cost of attacking Iran is far too much for the United States to maintain on a long-term basis. That cost has primarily been expressed through oil barrel costs of crude oil, which have risen dramatically. And you've already started to see this at the pump, right? That's the most immediate place that Americans are going to realize this cost. This has trickle-down effects. This affects fertilizers. This affects food supplies. Not necessarily that farmers are going to increase their costs. The farmers are probably going to get hosed too, which has been par for the course in the Trump administration. But these suppliers are going to have a price increase, and your food is going to increase in price. And this is one of those things where most Americans are already suffering. It hasn't hit yet in any real sense. It'll take a while. These things the elasticity of markets is a tricky thing. It'll start to come in the next couple of weeks, I think, as this continues, especially if something happens at Card Island. The markets have been very reactive to this crisis. The other half of that is, in order to try to stem that crisis, the Trump administration has apparently temporarily lessened sanctions on Russia, which is bad for Ukraine because Russia's oil sanctions were working, coupled with Ukraine's campaign of strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. It was causing severe economic depression in Russia. And we've just kind of screwed Ukraine. So we're losing the strategic picture on a global scale, even as the situation in the Middle East deteriorates. All in all, this has been arguably a case of military malpractice on the parts of Trump and Hetzketh. And I am now very firmly of the opinion that the votes to confirm Hetzketh were treasonous. He is manifestly unqualified to lead the United States into war. Yes, it is a problem that it is when everything is getting planted. There are farmers making outlays for things they can no longer afford. Farm bankruptcies are through the roof already from the tariffs, and they're just going to increase. This is a monumental crisis. It's also a self-inflicted wound, in a very real sense. None of this had to happen. This is not being waged to the United States' advantage. But as we're getting into this, and as we're looking at the prospect of landing troops on Iranian territory proper, we start to look at this from terms of distance. We have managed, to a certain extent, Iran's counterattacks in the Gulf and against Israel. The critical interceptor shortage that I was talking about when the 12-day war began last year has come to a head. Reports today that Israel is officially stating they are short on interceptors. They are also facing the prospect of being outflanked in Lebanon by Hezbollah, which is darkly hilarious when you consider how much celebration Israel did when they did their little pager bombing terrorist attack last year as well. So what has happened is, while the attacks from Iran have lessened in intensity, the attacks from Lebanon have increased in two very real ways. The first is rocket attacks into northern Israel proper. And these have been somewhat ongoing for a while, but they have increased ever since Israel attacked Iran. The second is, you now have Hezbollah fighters who are deploying themselves in positions well outside rifle range of IDF positions and deploying anti-tank missiles, which means they can fire on Israeli positions from outside the range that Israeli riflemen can retaliate. Yes, yeah, they're critically short on contemporary interceptors. This has prompted Israel to suggest that Israel is going to be uh, invading southern Lebanon at the very least. I had this conversation with Hetman last night, who pointed out that he thought Hezbollah was not long for this world because of how unpopular Hezbollah is in Lebanon. And I think this is a common mistake that a lot of people are making when they think about Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and Al Qaeda. They forget that the conflict is what they need to be sustainable and to survive. Hezbollah exists as a consequence of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon back in the 80s. It was not something that existed prior to that. It existed in reaction to the tactics that Israel engaged in to pursue Palestinians in Lebanon and how they engaged Muslims in Lebanon broadly. Hamas is really the same way. Hamas is a consequence of the tactics that Israel used in Gaza and the West Bank, and they are reflections of that as well. These organizations exist to fight Israel. Israeli commenters will like to point out that they exist to kill because they hate Jews, and that's probably true, I think, in a lot of cases, in many cases, and that's mostly an artifact of the fact of circumstance, not really a choice of ideology. The truth of the matter is that if Zionism was, the product of Quakers and Quakers had made Israel, then Hezbollah and Hamas would hate Quakers with just as much intensity, because it's not about the fact that they're Jewish. It's about what they have, the Israelis have done to the people that they have subjugated, that has created Hezbollah and Hamas. If Israel invades southern Lebanon, the popularity of Hezbollah as they resist will increase dramatically. It will stabilize them in the exact same way that Hamas's flagging fortunes were stabilized post October 7th. The reality is that the battles themselves are what strengthen these organizations. They can take these casualties. They do not care if you kill their supreme leader. They do not care if you kill whoever you kill. They will just keep coming. They will appoint new leaders. And this is the same model that Iran has used. We were very, very celebratory in how we killed the Ayatollah, only to find that they appointed a new Ayatollah. The man is not as big as the mission. And the problem is, we know these things. We know that if something were to happen to Donald Trump tomorrow, J.D. Vance will seamlessly step into his office and take over. Something happening to Donald Trump is not the end of the United States. It is not the end of the administration. It is not the end of their priorities. We know this intellectually, but we presume that because you kill a Sinwar or a Bin Laden, that this will end something, that it's anything more than theater or an Ayatollah Khomeini. And that's just simply not the case. The reality is that there is no military solution to the problem of Hezbollah or Hamas. Historically speaking, invading Lebanon has not been Israel's strongest move. It has not gone well for them in the past. The fact that they're considering it is a major strategic victory for Iran, because you will need troops to go into southern Lebanon. You will need airplanes to support them, and that will decrease the operational tempo of Israeli strikes on Iran proper. So this isn't even the end of Iran's bag of tricks when it comes to proxies. The Houthis have been very, very quiet for some reason. Yes, ATGMs are not at all vulnerable to interceptors in any meaningful way. They fly much too slow and much too low to the ground, and then they pop up and hit tanks. No, that you don't shoot down ATGMs. You just don't get shot by them. That's really the thing to do. That's why tanks have tactics where they roll up on a target, fire, and retreat before you can acquire a lock with an ATGM. Pretty basic armor tactics, though. The rockets are really the thing that is draining Iron Dome's supplies, and the drones in particular that are being launched from Lebanon require the more advanced missiles. So what you're looking at really is a strategically unsustainable situation. The United States does not have a sufficiently large military to conduct a full-scale invasion of Iran. At minimum, you're looking at 1.5 million men, probably, which is about 400,000 less the total size of the United States military. In order to sustain an invasion, you'd require a draft. I very seriously doubt that the Republican Congress will be willing to institute a draft in an election year when they're already up against the wall, particularly on a war that is deeply unpopular and has not been properly justified to the American people. A limited action in trying to seize a oil terminal like Karg Island will probably end in disaster for American forces. Not necessarily a large-scale disaster, but when you consider what's happening, why American ships don't enter the strait proper, because they understand that the visual of an American ship burning or a large number of casualties, such as what happened in Kuwait early in the war, is devastating for America in a very real sense. This war has become less about the tactical successes on the ground and more about the overall strategic picture and how that picture looks to people. Because it is undeniable that the United States has been winning tactical victories, destroying missile launchers, destroying locations, attacking IGRC positions. None of that, though, is in service of a strategy that coherently ends the conflict, and therefore none of it really matters. And to get historical in the fact, it's kind of the Chancellorsville problem. It's kind of the Chancellorsville problem, where you have Robert E. Lee winning the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, and it's thought to be his greatest victory of all time. He takes a much smaller Confederate force and he puts a much larger Union force on the run. And he does this by dividing his forces in contravention of established military theory at the time, even now, actually. And this is considered a famous victory, and it does a significant damage to the Army of the Potomac, which they have reconstituted themselves months later. The question about Chancellorsville is never the tactical brilliance of Lee on the field. The question is, what did it accomplish in the long run that advanced the Confederate cause? And that's the issue. You can look at something and say, well, this is tactically brilliant. It's well done, it's well executed, but it doesn't get me anywhere. Which is why when we talk about military theory, we talk about different levels of warfare. And traditionally you have three. You have the tactical, the operational, and the strategic. And as we've needed to be more granular, we've added stuff like individual tactics for equipment and whatnot, or geostrategic. But broadly speaking, tactics are what you do in a battle to win the battle, to do the thing, to accomplish the objective. That would be the things like bombing missile launchers, taking out IRGC posts, etc. Operational is the methodology by which you have oriented these battles that you are fighting towards a policy that is defined by the nation's strategy. So here, what you have, the question that we have to ask is, what is the United States trying to do in Iran? And there's a very real problem, because even in the beginning of the war, we hear Donald Trump going, we are going to end the regime in Iran. Very quickly, it was apparent to everyone that this was not going to happen. And then it became, we are going to degrade their missile launchers. And that's like, great, but that doesn't end the war either. And then it became, we're fighting because Israel was going to attack Iran. And then it's like, no, we forced Israel into it. And it's been a general mess. And no one knows what's happening right now. No one knows why. They're just doing. And they're not doing towards any objective. They're doing towards the short-term, day-to-day, what do I have to do to advance my mission for the day? Not how does this mission fit into the larger picture. And the problem with this is that this is the job of the Secretary of Defense and the job of the Joint Chiefs. And I don't want to say the Joint Chiefs weren't willing to do this job, but it doesn't seem like they have been allowed to. No one knows what the end state of Iran is going to be. And therefore, we don't know what victory looks like. So American soldiers are coming home wounded. They're coming home dead. And we don't know what for. We can't answer that question. And I truly feel I truly feel that the president is as commander-in-chief and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State as the principals who are in charge of these type of things have an obligation to the service members and their families to lay these things out in absolute concrete terms so that we can understand them and be able to say, I know what we are doing and why we are doing it. And that simply hasn't happened. And that is, I think, tragic. Um, you now have 5 more on a KC-135 that was lost over Iraq, in addition to the 6 that have already come back deceased. That's just the beginning. There's going to be more as this continues. That's inevitable. It's just the way the operations work and the tempo of things. Uh, I guess disappointed that this is what's happening. It is an embarrassment for the United States. We didn't need to fight this war. There's nothing to gain from it. There's nothing the Iranians will gain from it. And so my disappointment is visceral for this. That said, I didn't want to just have a short update tonight. President Sunday, who we all know and love, came out with a video a few days ago where he talks about regime change, and we're going to react to that. But we're going to take a short break first. So I'm going to get some more water, and when we come back, we're going to get started on that. Right, you are. Hi, everybody. I'm back. Oh, we only lost 5 people. Fantastic. Yeah, tonight's not going to be a good night. Sunday you're streaming, watching Brooks get yelled at by someone called Jim Bob. It is something else. Anywho, yeah, it is a Sunday jump scare. Anywho, this is President Sunday's video. Regime change doesn't mean what you think. I have notes.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well.
I am, thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Iran-US-Israel war and not how it's going to turn out so much, because there is no turning out in history, actually, especially not under conditions of war. But there are things to pay attention to, and I want to talk in very broad terms to try and get across.
That's just a generally weird statement that I think I would ask him to elaborate on, and I will in a very short order.
A problem in the way a lot of people think about warfare and about politics generally that is represented both at a popular level and, as we've seen recently, with the embracing of, frankly, kooks like Professor Jang, who is not a professor, by leftists and rightists alike, at sort of a pseudo-academic level. Because, unfortunately, it's just a lot easier.
Okay, actually, this is worth talking about. I've watched like 5 minutes of Professor Jang. He's a fucking nut job. Anti-Semite, just generally does not have any idea what he's talking about. He just sort of gestures around and draws on a chalkboard. So him not being a professor is not really nearly as important as the fact that he's, insane. Here's the biggest problem that you're going to have. There is a gigantic gap between warfare as it actually occurs and warfare as it's popularly understood that is not bridged very well. And what do I mean by this? This is particularly in the United States, where we have an all-volunteer army. Therefore, not many people are engaged in, military science or theory as it is. This creates a problem. People think that they understand more because they pick up popular history books or they watch movies, and they get these ideas about what does and does not work, and they run with it, or they watch documentaries on History Channel or the Military Channel when that was a thing. The problem is that there is a whole academic profession, and it exists on layers of what does it mean to go to war, and how do you win a war as nations have become more complicated, that has had to exist. It starts emerging after Napoleon, after the Napoleonic Wars with Clausewitz or Jomini. You end up with these very, very thick books like on war or The Art of War by Jomini. And then you find these things being taught in military academies and increasingly in war colleges. And like one of these things that's playing out right now is a number of military officers who never went to war college, who never qualified for it. On Twitter, Infantry Dort, who was a major, got promoted to lieutenant colonel very shortly before Trump got elected, or maybe after. I'd have to double check. Whose career was terminal, but he basically exists to tweet out nonsense that Hesketh likes. Who are poo-pooing the entire idea of war colleges as why we lost Afghanistan. Like there's some kind of separation between war fighters and staff officers. And this is a very popular idea that's totally historically ungrounded, to be frank. There is a difference. Like soldiers who enlist and go to basic training and do combat arms do a very different specialized job. They don't necessarily understand the tasks being done by the S3 or the S4, or why it's important. Like, oh, supply, it's important, I get my stit. Logistics, it's important, I get my shit. Intelligence, that's just a portion of the 5-paragraph op order. That doesn't necessarily mean anything to me on the ground. Blah 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 blah, etc. And that's a very popular message, because these are the people who we admire, insofar as when we admire military figures. We don't admire the pogue in the back doing the staff job. We admire the combat veteran, the Audie Murphys of the world, right? And so you've had this move from Hesketh to start divesting of professional military education. And you can obviously see how poorly this is going in Iran right now, as the Middle East, as we don't have people who are willing to have a coherent discussion. Or rather, we have them, but they've been sidelined and silenced. And then you have all these people who are absolutely sure they know that the real way to win the war is to kill the enemy, and we killed Ayatollah Khomeini, and he's dead, and that'll surely win us the war. And no, it hasn't. Go figure.
For gurus to, reach out to the general public and gain a general audience than it is for people who talk at a very high level, do very high level research, and whose expertise is talking to peers at high levels of research, not to the average person, scrolling down their feed. And so to start with, I want to talk about a bit of an analysis.
Here's the trouble. I know Commander Rick Millen has been on this show before. He is obviously very knowledgeable, and we enjoy having him. He's retired, which works out really well. He can talk freely for the most part. I know actively serving war college instructors. We've had one on this show before. I'm very, very careful about how I employ them as guests in order to protect their careers, so they don't get in a position where they might be inclined to speak on things that could get them in trouble. I'm even more cautious about it now in this present environment than I was before.
Analogy in antibiotics. So you've probably heard that it's not a good thing for doctors to be handing out antibiotics to every single patient who asks for it. And the reason is that when you use antibiotics too much, it kills not just the bacteria that may be making you sick or sore at this particular moment, it also kills all the good bacteria. And what this does is it clears the ground for bacteria that may be not thriving right now, but is still resistant to the antibiotic, to take over all of that newly cleared space and to thrive. And so you can have populations now of antibiotics resistant bacteria exploding in population. And boom, now you have diseases that you no longer have a treatment for. The bombing of Iran has been characterized by some as essentially assassination on a mass scale. I think I actually heard that from, I think it was Robert Pape on the Radio War Nerd podcast. And I think this is fairly accurate. There seems to be a very...
Pape has been pretty bearish on all of this.
Naive presumption that all that is required to perform regime change, and we'll talk in a moment a little bit about what that actually means, is you cut the head off the snake and then you make a deal with the people remaining. This is not how anything actually works. It appears as though the Trump administration really only planned for a week or so long conflict. It seems like it was timed to shake the markets as little as possible, and it seems like they were really hoping to bomb the bejesus out of Iran, ask for a ceasefire, get a deal, and then move on to the next thing. This is not how that works. Iran is a modern state. Iran is a very sophisticated engine. It has multiple fail-safes. Its levels work autonomously to each other. The Ayatollah was not, bussing around Iran like Stoic from How to Train Your Dragon, solving everybody's little problems so that when he's gone, everyone's like, oh goodness gracious, whatever will we do? I guess we'll surrender.
Okay, I think most people get that, honestly, on a certain level. But let's keep moving.
There are doctrines in place. There is discipline in place. There are autonomous branches of government. There are autonomous agencies. Everything has a plan for how to fight a war once the head is cut off. In the exact same way that Iran is not economically crippled just because one person in one office is confused. There are thousands upon thousands of experts that are making Iran work every single day. And the figureheads at the top are not the regime of Iran. The figureheads at the top are the people who are sitting on the chairs of the regime of Iran.
Sort of. What you're describing is the bureaucracy of a modern state. The bureaucracy is a component of, but the people who are sitting in the chairs are the ones who move the bureaucracy in a particular direction. So really, and like, you're not going to get rid of Bob from accounting. Like, that's not feasible. But what you can do is you can get rid of Bob's boss and put a new boss in place. So like, if you say regime change is getting rid of all these people, and therefore we're not actually doing regime change because Bob is still in accounting, that's not really, like, that's semantically unsound. Bob is not, the linchpin upon which the direction of the country moves. Like, heads of state have a function beyond sitting in a chair. Heads of state are move states. They move them in different directions. Look no further than Trump. Look no further than the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Look no further than any function of these. Prime Minister, I would note, is head of state only in the capacity that he is exercising on behalf of the king, before someone I know who yells at me about the nature of English sovereignty.
What is a regime? When we talk about regime change, we tend to think of it in terms of figureheads because in North American politics especially, figureheads really are more important than the actual institutions, at least in our imaginary, because we see them campaigning all the time. The campaigns never end. But a regime really is not one person's tenure in office or even one party's tenure in office. A regime really is a particular organization of the political body as a whole, whether you want to call it a polity or a polis or whatever, a citizen body maybe. It gets a little bit strange because these are Greek terms and we don't live in that world anymore. But fundamentally, a regime is the organizational structure of the state itself. Just as you do not have to consciously be aware of all of your organs' functions in order for them to continue to function. In fact,
I feel like someone is deluging on my state.
You are often not aware of any of their functions. They happen autonomously. Same with a modern state. The Ayatollah did not keep...
Bureaucracies do not function autonomously. They are directed, they have policies. Those policies change and may be changed by bureaucrats at lower levels beyond merely elected officials. Appointed officials have considerable control over a policy. You're correct to say that we tend to see elected officials as and figureheads as important, primarily because most people do not have the bandwidth to know who is appointed what in a state, right? They're not thinking of who's my Secretary of State and who is my etc., especially if you have multiple levels of government. This is not that they are unimportant. They are immensely important. In fact, the biggest things that stick in your gut and fuck you over in the United States of America are happening in unelected bureaucrats making policy decisions that have wide-ranging implications for small communities. The ability to change those policies is what regime change is about. So if Bob from accounting suddenly becomes senior accountant and starts, throwing grenades at people, stopping Bob from throwing grenades is in fact changing the regime.
All the parts of the state running, he served a limited role. He was a person who occupied a chair. It's an important chair, but it's not critical.
It's a very important chair in the case of Ayatollah Khomeini, and it's actually very critical for the future of the country because there is a turnout here. Khomeini was a moderate. Bold statement, I know, but Khomeini was the guy who said, let's not build a nuclear weapon, let's build nuclear power. Khomeini was the man who advocated restraint. He is dead now. The people around him are dead now. The people who will sit in those chairs and form the new policy direction of Iran are no longer the people who believe in restraint. This is important. In a very real sense, the regime has changed. It's now much, much worse than it was before. Policy and policymakers matter. And to argue that they don't is kind of obtuse.
Critical for life, right? It's critical for certain advanced functions under conditions of, not the total breakdown of the international order, say. It's important for diplomacy and so on. But the Ayatollah's role is not the head, literally, of the state.
No one thinks
States are functionally headless.
no one. Okay, they're not functionally headless. They are headless, but no one thinks that he's like the Ayatollah is literally the brain of the state. No one really thinks this. People understand that leaders have advisors. They understand that there are bureaucracies. I don't think this distinction is necessarily as profound as we're hoping it's going to be.
However, the persons who occupy those chairs are still the humans who make decisions. So what happens when you assassinate a bunch of humans in chairs, but you don't actually break down the structure that puts people into those chairs and determines which chairs there are and what they can do? You shuffle the decks. So you may have taken out the nominal head of Iran, but you haven't taken out the brain of Iran, which is able to put another person in that place. And the Ayatollah that was just killed happens to be the Ayatollah who issued a fatwa saying Iran would never get a nuclear weapon. Some problems may be occurring to you at this point. Sometimes.
Well, yes, but primarily with the point that that's a very important chair, right? It defined Iran's nuclear policy.
When you kill a figurehead, somebody weaker takes his place, and maybe indeed the entire society will capitulate. Maybe their armaments run out. Maybe everyone collectively is like, you know what, this is too much bother. Let's just surrender to the United States, whatever. But sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes you get change. Sometimes the cards are shuffled in such a way as a stronger hand materializes, seemingly out of nowhere.
Hardly ever seemingly out of nowhere. No, you're exactly going to get a stronger hand to emerge, right? Shaking up a political order is almost always a risk. However, again, this isn't that the political order isn't important. It's very important, right? The state is the state and the regime is more than just the functionaries and the bureaucrats and the leaders. It is the policies they pursue. You can make the argument tomorrow that if Benjamin Netanyahu suddenly decides to recognize a Palestinian state, that is not a new regime, and you'd be somewhat correct, but that would be a radically new policy direction for Israel, right? It represents a significant change in the way they interact with their neighbor. You can force a regime to change its mind, to move it to a new position. The failure of this regime change is not that we're not switching out killing people or bureaucrats, etc., etc. The failure of this regime change is that we're not moving the policies that this regime is engaging in. They are hardening those positions instead of creating new ones that are to our advantage.
Sometimes bolder, braver measures seem more intuitive after a clean sweep, like the total destruction of, the current public-facing leadership of Iran. And Iran is refusing a ceasefire. Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is receiving satellite information from Russia. Iran, as a consequence of this attack, is no longer just Iran. Iran is the frontier of a growing global coalitional contest, which makes Iran strong in a way Iran wasn't before. It makes Iran dangerous in a way.
Not particularly. Uh, Here's what's going to happen in the aftermath of Iran. The regime is going to stay intact. They're going to have new, much more hardline leaders, and China is going to roll into Iran and build them a brandy new oil infrastructure that to replace what's destroyed. And they're going to get exclusive rights to significant amounts of Iranian oil, and they're going to probably start deploying military forces to Iran. Not because it's a coalition, but because they can use this to make Israel think twice. Because now, if I attack Iran, I risk attacking China. And it's not that you have Iran and China being buddy-buddy. It's definitely China taking advantage of Iran and taking advantage of Iran's state to improve their position, both in the broader area of Asia and across the world. It's not a coalition. It is very predatory in its nature. In a way that coalitions simply are not in contemporary geopolitics. NATO isn't really predatory. NATO is a alliance of interests. You can have people leave that alliance without problem. France, for example. And this is, I think, a primary difference between the way that we have looked at alliances in the past, and the Soviets/Russia has, and the Chinese have. China looks for advantage. It looks for places to take advantage. Russia looks for control of their partners like Poland and Hungary, etc. Even now, they look for control. Even as a consequence of the fall of the Warsaw Pact, it's a different kind of control, but they look for control. The United States does not control the military fates of Denmark or United Kingdom or France or Germany. We don't. We negotiate with them. We engage with them, but we do not control them the same way that the Russians did. There is there is a give and a take. There is a difference to how we exercise our hegemonic power to how hegemonic power has been traditionally exercised. The coercive element is softer. It's soft power. In China's case, they are directly economically benefiting and creating economic situations where they can take from other countries. And that is what they will do here.
Way Iran wasn't before. Sort of like how the Houthis in Yemen, not particularly dangerous until suddenly Iran takes notice because they see an interest in empowering the Houthis, and now all of a sudden the Houthis aren't just the Houthis anymore. Anyone who tries to understand the logic of what the Iranian regime, and by the Iranian regime I do not mean the people, I do not mean the people sitting in chairs, I don't mean the citizen population, I mean a particular organizational apparatus that controls the economic and military power within the territory that the international system of states treats as Iran, if you will. Anyone who tries to...
That was painful. Just call it the state of Iran. Like, yes, we understand that these things are to a certain degree abstracted, but states functionally exist, even if they are not, concrete things that are morphable. Just a painful. Iran is borders. Yes, okay, cool. But like, we understand that the Iranian regime is an expression of its bureaucracy and its people, though.
Explain the logic of what the Iranian regime does by way of religion. Like, they think America's the great Satan. They think there's a 12th Imam coming or whatever. They think there's a God-directed apocalypse on the horizon. Is a fool.
Sure.
States do not allow for the selection of people who abide by that logic into positions of power.
Usually. Sometimes they do, and it usually works out poorly.
They are fundamentally organizations of...
That's somewhat flippant. There are a lot of people. Okay, there are not. Let's take America for example, and evangelical Christianity as the example in question. Evangelical Christianity has a apocalyptic, and I mean that in the worst possible way, Armageddon, I guess, not apocalyptic in the theological sense, component to it. they're nuts. The guy in the pew who's pretending to have speak in tongues to the pastor and the guy in the pew probably believe in the apocalypse. The global senior pastor for the megachurch probably does not. Doesn't matter. Global senior pastor will use these ideas to propel himself to a political career, etc., and become, a congressman or a senator or try to run for president. Once he gets there, there will be people who will moderate these views, and there will be a whole bunch of disappointed people in pews doing tongues. But overall, you're getting a person who's willing to invoke these things without necessarily believing them. But they're really fucking useful if you want to propagandize. Getting people emotionally involved in fighting Iran by saying they call us the Great Satan is really useful because, like, I'm not Satan. I'm just a regular guy. I was, doing my thing. Of course they don't believe that. Lindsey Graham doesn't believe half the shit he says about all this. But he's got to try to sell it. And you sell to the guy in the pew. You don't sell to me. You sell to the guy in the pew speaking tongues.
Of brutal, pragmatic coercion at every single level. That is how they work. Whether or not this is simply through bureaucracy or whether this is through men with masks and guns knocking on your door. That is how states function. They do not function according to a religious logic at all. There's a great book by Wael Halak called The Impossible State. Look, it's right here. I forgot to have it up in the original recording. It's about Iran. It's about specifically the post-revolutionary Iranian constitution. And in that, Halak goes into detail about how the very structure of the modern state, its very liberal presumptions, even in a supposed theocracy, and the notion of selfhood that modern law requires in order for state administration to function. And I'm not talking about law in the sense of the kinds of laws that you impose, whether or not these are religiously informed, but I mean the very form of law itself, the very way in which it interfaces with human subjects as individuals, possessing rights and reason and responsibility as tokens and being capable of exchanging these for other tokens, freedom for security and so on and so forth, being constituted as individuals essentially separate from the human environment around them. These are directly contrary to Islamic ethics outside of this context. Iran is a state. Iran is a state in the same way as Hegel's Prussia was a state. It's the same kind of thing as the United States and Canada. You can have a Catholic in the presidency. The United States is not therefore a Catholic entity. It is a state. It is a cold monster that makes pragmatic decisions based on interest, or what it perceives as interest, and it is possessed.
Yeah, but that's the very issue at play, right? What it perceives and what you believe will change your perceptions. Like, you don't need to look that far to see how that plays out in some place like Israel, where people are making religious decisions that have real world consequences. The presumption that the West Bank is actually, promised to Israelis is a religious idea, but it has real world political consequences and economic consequences and consequences that are life or death. A person who believes a thing, which is why it's very useful to not have people believing in the apocalypse in positions of power, might move towards it. Like, that concept that a state is merely pragmatic and merely impossible to move by the will of a small group of people is almost naive. Like, you can very much have people who will turn around and come into power in the United States and look at a giant pile of nuclear weapons and go, excellent, I could start Armageddon. Not beyond the realm of possibility. And is it pragmatic? No, not in any reasonable definition of pragmatism, but it's not impossible. the balance that we're talking about, the guys in the pews versus the people who are manipulating them, is only possible so long as the guy in the pew doesn't become so powerful that he starts manipulating people. Because there's nothing more terrifying than a true believer. You can square any circle theologically very, very easily, and people do all the fucking time. Like, it's not that hard. So, like, to say that they're not really Islamic kind of ignores how theology builds and wraps around itself. Like, theology is always evolving, and theology adapts to the world it lives in.
By an obsession with violence, because that is its existence. Bombings from the air do not rewrite the code that makes up the constitution of a massive, advanced, and sophisticated state like Iran. It simply doesn't work that way. And Iran is not corrupt enough for a mere signal act of removing the head of state from power, or from existence, as the case may be, to be enough to make the whole thing bend. That's not how this works. In the exact same way as if the White House was flattened by an alien spaceship tomorrow, as happens in some popular movies, the United States would not therefore cease to exist. Obviously. That's not how any of this works. So
we will go on. We will not go into the night. We will celebrate our Independence Day. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
Here's a prediction that's actually fairly safe. And by the way, anybody who talks about
You cannot go at the beginning, there are no outcomes in history, and then go, here's a prediction. I'm sorry, you can't do it. But you can, it just makes me mad.
This conflict as if there is even such a thing as winners or losers, as if the conflict...
There very much is such a thing as winners or losers. I don't know where you would get this from.
Itself doesn't radically change everyone involved to the point of being completely unrecognizable from where they are before.
Well, that just means that your war aims change. It doesn't mean you haven't won or lost. That just means the presumptions I had at the outset of this war about what my objectives are have been changed by the strategic reality of it, trying to achieve those objectives, which is true of all things, not just things as terrifying and dramatic as war. Like, it's very much the case where you go into life and like, consider me, for example. The realities of having kidney disease definitely changed the trajectory of my career. It doesn't mean that I have not had a career, or that the state of being has wildly altered, or that I haven't had successes or failures along the way. It just means that the thing that I recognized at the beginning as being an end state is no longer a possible end state of my career, and therefore I have had to make adjustments.
Is ridiculous. That's not how this works. There is no such thing as triumph or defeat, really. That's not how any of this...
You gotta expand on this. Like, I need something here. Like, why is there not such a thing as triumph? Why is there not such a thing as defeat?
Works. The Ayatollah is dead. Was Iran defeated? No. Was the Ayatollah defeated? No.
I mean, technically, yes. He is now significantly smaller and more spread out than he was.
That's not how it works.
How does it work?
Iran does not win this war. And the United States does not lose this war. But the United States does lose.
Okay, it's close. Iran does not win this war. Israel and the United States do not win this war. Both suffer strategic defeats. Not impossible. But someone is going to win this war. Russia is already winning this war by being able to win their own war in Ukraine more readily, by being able to reduce their economic suffering, to be able to prolong their ability to make war in Ukraine beyond the capacity that they were going to before. China is going to benefit from this war. China is going to benefit from a United States posture that allows us, that means we are much less likely to intervene in places like the Philippines and the South China Sea and Taiwan, because we are now low on weapons, that we are now wary of engagements and entanglements. People win. You got to look at the whole board, not just the pieces in front of you. Is Iran going to come out of this smelling like daisies? No. Iran is going to come out of this full of rubble and dead people and ruinous things. Is the United States coming out of this with a win? No. We're going to come out of this looking like a bunch of overeager jackasses. Is Israel going to come out of this as a win? No. Israel hasn't been able to come up with a win in 4 years, despite the fact that they keep killing everyone. They just have to translate it into wins. This is where we have to understand the nature of what tactics and how tactics operationally link into strategy. Then you see where the failures occur, but you don't go, well, no one has really won. Yeah, someone has won because there's a level above strategic. There's geostrategic. Someone has won because the pieces are not just the pieces that you're playing with. They're the pieces that other people are playing with too. This situation is bigger than just Iran. And it always has been. This is why I don't like the concept of proxy wars, by the way. People talk about things like, oh, this is a proxy war in Syria because other people are fighting, and Russia and the United States are fighting and supplying weapons to these sides. And like, how is that different from any war in history? Does that make World War II a proxy war? Is Lend-Lease a proxy war? Does that make the Peloponnesian War, where the Persians supply the Spartans with a fleet twice to beat the Athenians? Is that a proxy war? Wars do not happen in vacuums. They happen in the context of their strategic and geopolitical arenas. And therefore, the concept of outside players not being involved in the war doesn't really work, because you are affected by what happens to your neighbors. More so now than ever, because we are able to communicate better, but still, there isn't just a strict separation between the two. And if all wars are proxy wars, then no wars are proxy wars, right? At the end of the day. Like, understanding that war does not take place in a vacuum is very important to this day and age.
And the way it loses is not by being outmaneuvered. It's not by being surprised by some sudden influx of material that it didn't account for. It's not by running out of missiles. The United States loses exactly the same kind of thing that Iran has recently gained by being the target of the United States, by becoming now a nexus point of coalition assertion against American hegemony.
No, the United States is very much being outmaneuvered. The closing of the Strait of Hormuz was not unanticipated, but unplanned, unaddressed. We have been outmaneuvered. It's just that simple. More to the point, this isn't the beginning of some grand thing. This is Iran will work to secure Iran's best deal, and they will let everyone else down. The Houthis, Hezbollah, they're all means towards Iran's ends, not and the same ways the relationship. The Hezbollah uses Iran as a means towards an end. China will use Iran as a means towards an end. They will battle to see who can take best advantage of one another, not as a coalition, but as merely temporary partners with somewhat aligned interests.
That web of connections that creates the texture of power and resistance, its actual political strength. This is what the United States sacrifices for the sake of a superficial signal assault on Iran's face, for the sake of taking trophies to make the presidency of Donald Trump appear strong.
I did not notice how distracting these cuts were until I looked at it full screen.
When the very desperation of these attempts signals exactly the opposite. Professor Zhang, quote-unquote, who again is not a professor, he has an undergraduate degree at best, at least according to his Wikipedia page, made the absurd claim on Breaking Points that Trump may have been motivated to attack Iran because of hubris from the success of Venezuela. This is silly. Venezuela wasn't a success. The Maduro regime still persists. Trump.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter what happened. You and I know that Venezuela was not a success. Trump thinks it was a success. The people around Trump think it's a success. Here's the thing that has Venezuela in particular. Let's use this. What Donald Trump does is Donald Trump comes in, he throws some shit around, and then declares himself the winner and walks away, and everyone goes, "Oh, look how fucking smart he is. He played 4D chess." And then they ignore the after effects of this. This works really well in a domestic environment, by the way, up until the point where you have to elect someone else, which is what the Republicans will hopefully discover at the midterms if Donald Trump doesn't try to take them over for some reason. Like you can declare propaganda victories all day, and he does. The problem with this is like Venezuela, he goes, he captures a single guy, and they bring him back. In terms of basic tactical options, you have succeeded. That was the limit of the operation, right? We're going to seize Maduro, we're going to put his cronies in charge, and that's it. Stupid plan. Horrifyingly dumb plan, by the way, but it was successful. They did that thing. It just didn't yield anything. Iran is different. Donald Trump gets up and says, we're going to destroy the regime. The regime is still intact. Donald Trump thinks that he can go, I'm going to go bomb Iran, and Iran is going to take it on the chin, and that'll be that. Iran fights back. And not only do they fight back in a legal way, in a way that maximizes the pain that everyone that is associated with the United States feels in the region, and everyone that in a very visceral way, right? They attack hotels, they attack oil terminals, they attack a desalination plant, which we did first, etc., etc., etc. Down the line, right? Very visceral. Iran, he cannot just walk away from Iran, which is why we're getting this more and more incoherent strategy as we continue forward, because he can't walk away. He cannot declare success as much as he's trying to, because Iran continues to resist, and they will continue to resist. It's how their government is built. It's built to be shattered and still operational.
Merely kidnapped an old man who might have died of natural causes the following day for all he knew. Would the state of Venezuela have fallen then, spontaneously? No, clearly not. That's not how this works. And in addition to this...
No, but the people he put in charge were willing to play ball with his desires. Was the regime changed? In a sense. The policy is different. Of course, the policy he needed to check in on was the oil companies who would extract the oil, and he didn't do that. But at the very least, again, success. Just it was a stupid plan, but it was a successfully executed stupid plan.
He didn't get their oil, so nothing happened. If anything, he is feeling significantly more insecure than he was before this, because he looked like a fool. He got all of the oil execs together, and they told him, we can't get this oil, Donald. You destabilized the country. What if they take our money when we invest it? What if we invest billions of dollars, and a military junta just steals all of our capital? Think, Donald, think. So this is why the United States may lose even though Iran doesn't win, right? Because as a consequence of a conflict that was entirely illegal, more or less entirely endorsed by both leading parties, either silently or loudly, and due to its total failure to rally its own people behind it in the prosecution of this highly illegal war, as well as the total breakdown of the capacity for certain countries to have any diplomatic relationship with the United States at all, at least one in which they can have any faith of there being follow-through on any promises whatsoever, the United States will become a pariah. It has already become so.
Yes, but no. The United States is kind of in the category of states that is too big and omnipresent to fail. particularly because we hold the world's reserve currency. You might go, I can't trust the United States, but I still have to deal with them. A pariah is someone like North Korea, who I don't have to deal with. I can safely ignore if necessary. A pariah is what Israel is becoming, who they are not strategically important, and therefore you can go around them. Economically important. A pariah, a state that actually is a pariah, is going, like you might say, Iran is a pariah. Not really. Iran is able to export things to other countries that they need. No one's working that hard to run blockades of North Korea, for example. Pariahs need pariahs are people you don't need. Like, you might go, I don't trust the United States. So what are they going to do? They're going to look for positional advantage over the United States, which means that you're going to have relationships that were previously cordial become much more adversarial. People are going to be looking to see what they can get out of the United States. And it's going to make someone like Trump feel really good because he likes to think of himself as powerful and kingmaker. And what he's really going to be doing is sacrificing.
So it will be far more so now, and it will not have obtained the capital gains that will generate the confidence in its continued ascendancy to make other countries look past this and hope that things will go back to normal. And so as a
I don't think, I think it was bullshit what we did with the negotiations with Iran, but I do not think that this will broadly affect Europe. They will continue to operate as they have. There is an understanding. And I think more to the point, European countries that previously might not have will take a look at Israel and take a look at Russia and start to interfere in American politics in a much more aggressive way, because they will want to be able to secure from the American electorate the outcomes that Russia and Israel have secured from the American electorate. And they understand now, by watching Russia and Israel, how to do it.
Consequence of this, in line with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech in January, middle powers, and indeed greater powers that are not direct beneficiaries of American hegemony, will collude to divert capital power, capital concentration away from the United States. They will play nice with the United States to get as much as they can, as indeed Mark Carney has, in my opinion, very savvily been doing. And a lot of people are reading into signal statements of endorsement of the war with Iran that a lot of countries are simply on board with this. That is true in some cases for sure, but it also bears keeping in mind that just as when Donald Trump met with the oil execs concerning pillaging Venezuela's oil, smaller, less equipped oil companies were more gung-ho and on board, whereas the more critical, powerful ones that had the equipment to actually go in and get Venezuela's oil efficiently were more hesitant. A lot of these countries have no capacity whatsoever to actually facilitate or resist the war with Iran. They are making a strategic gambit all the time. It doesn't mean it's good, but it's something to keep in mind. These are not the kinds of friends that are going to stick by through thick and thin. There are pressures, real pressures, making them choose to put out an image that may not necessarily reflect their actual commitments, which are ultimately, because these are representatives of states, the security and prosperity of their regimes, not of their people, not of their values, of their regimes, of their power. In the exact same way that the cutting of aid meant that now all of these people for whom this aid was purposed are now no longer dependent upon the United States, and therefore the United States have no leverage over them. Similarly, by breaking down diplomacy in the way that Donald Trump has, the Iranian state is free. It is free from the illusion that it can prosper by capitulating to the United States and by cooperating with it. And with help from its allies, it will now seek greater and greater weapons to assert itself more in the next conflict, which there will be one, because the Iranian regime is not going to fall. It can't.
Yeah, here's the
It's
thing.
not that kind of thing. I'm going to sound like a broken record.
Okay, yes, it can. It just isn't going to. First off, like, yes, it can. Absolutely, it can. It just won't. Yes, there will be a period of rearmament. I don't think, like I said, I think China is going to take a much more active hand in Iran. I think China will start deploying troops to Iran in such a way that they will engage. That you will risk engaging Chinese troops in order to attack Iran. This is probably a radical prediction, but I think it's where we're going to be at. They're going to make substantial investments, and they're going to want guarantees in those investments. And the guarantee is not Chinese weapon systems. The guarantee is Chinese manpower. The guarantee is, if I fight Iran, I might also have to fight China. It's a natural step for China to take, too, as China makes more and more moves towards becoming a regional hegemon.
But I want to take
And it also gives China an incredibly secure base in the Middle East.
this down to the micro scale again. Because just as the web of common interests and connections, of real economic connections, not just political connections, and by economic I mean the transference of the conditions of life on this planet. I mean something not cold at all, something very serious, very close to home. In the same way that these connections create the possibility for what seems to be a contest between states escalating into a global conflict, we at this very small level, who right now, you may have noticed, have no say in any of this, we need to start investing really hard at an individual personal level to start reaching out to the people in our communities in the most banal ways. Be someone who helps somebody else collect their groceries. Be somebody who watches a dog. Be an ear when someone is upset. Help with someone's homework. Help walk someone's kids home from school if they're working. Be a part of someone's life in your community, so that if something happens to you, something happens to them. And if something happens to them, then something happens to you. That's power. That's how you resist top-down oppression. That's how you survive hardship and exigency. If you don't have that, you are like a lone piece in a game of backgammon or checkers or whatever. You are inviting disaster. This was a short off-the-cuff thing. I'm dealing with a lot of personal crises myself right now. And it's thanks to the fact that I have connections, as I've just described, that I am surviving it. However, I also have you guys, and you guys have come through very hard for me. If you want to help support the channel and support more content like this, and to free me up to do more content like this, please consider joining my Patreon, link in the description. I will be making a more structured video soon. I am doing it on the social contract and on certain creators who I actually have, as a change of pace, a lot of respect and admiration for, who use social contract language in a way that I think is problematic in a very interesting way. Yeah. Until then, thank you for listening.
Boop. All right. That also is the end of things. And I want to point out, obviously, we've benefited immensely from President Sunday's assistance over the years. I don't dislike him at all. However, sometimes I disagree. That is all I have for you tonight. Thank you for coming out. I'm working on video essays. Hetman has started working on a project where he goes and finds people who have survived horrifying things, such as the Seed of Mariupol, or uh, we're looking at a couple other events, like people who have survived atrocities, so that we can talk to them about their experiences. We will see if this pans out. It could be interesting. As for the rest of you, I hope you all have an excellent weekend and a good spring break, and have a good night, everybody.